Out on the frontier, nights were longer, darker, and lonelier than a city dweller could ever imagine. A man's only companions were the coyotes' distant howls and the restless rustle of prairie grass bending to the winter breeze. Inside a small log cabin, half hidden by a grove of cottonwoods, a cowboy lay stretched out on his bedroll, boots near the fire, hat tipped over his face. He had spent the day working cattle, patching fences, and chasing strays through the snow, and the weight of the wilderness pressed heavy on his shoulders. Sleep came slow, as it often did on nights when the wind whispered of danger. He was no stranger to hardship. Like many who had come west, he carried a past that left him quieter than most. The frontier gave little room for softness, and yet, somewhere beneath his rugged skin, he carried a longing for something more than cattle herding and cold nights alone. That longing was something he kept buried, knowing dreams didn't always belong to men who worked the open range. But fate had a way of stirring when a man least expected it. The firelight flickered low, casting shadows that stretched across the rough-hewn walls. Outside, the snow deepened, and the air grew sharper. He pulled his blanket tighter, telling himself the night would pass like every other, a steady march toward another day of labor. But as the embers dimmed, a sound stirred at the edge of his hearing, soft, careful, almost human. He shifted, lifting the brim of his hat. His hand rested near the rifle propped by the door. Out here, survival demanded a man listen close to every sound in the dark. The door creaked faintly, though he had latched it before laying down. A breath of icy air slipped into the room, and with it came a figure, quick and quiet as a shadow. He froze where he lay, eyes narrowing in the dim light. Whoever it was moved carefully, not like a thief searching for supplies, but like someone seeking shelter from the cold. He caught the faint outline, slender and cloaked in furs, but with movements more delicate than any outlaw he had known. Before he could speak, the figure knelt near his bedroll. A whisper of fabric brushed against him as a warmth pressed close. His breath caught. His instincts screamed to push away, to reach for his rifle, but something about the presence stilled his hand. The fire cracked just enough to catch her face for the briefest moment, and what he saw made his chest pound like a runaway horse. It was not an outlaw, nor a drifter from town. It was a young Apache woman, her dark eyes sharp as the night sky, her face half hidden beneath strands of black hair and a blanket drawn tight around her shoulders. She had slipped into his cabin with purpose, yet her trembling hands betrayed the bitter cold that had driven her there. Her gaze darted toward him, cautious, measuring, ready to flee if he made a sudden move. But she didn't run. As if the warmth of his body was the only barrier left between her and the merciless winter outside, the cowboy's mind raced. He had heard tales of raids, of tension brewing between settlers and Apache bands across the desert and plains. Men spoke of fierce battles and blood feuds that stretched back years. He knew well enough that trust was scarce between their kind. Yet here she was, an Apache woman in his bedroll, her breath uneven, her presence both startling and fragile. He felt every beat of his heart, each one louder than the last, as questions stormed his thoughts. Who was she? Why his cabin? And what danger might follow her through the dark? For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the crackle of the fire and the wind outside filled the silence. Her eyes met his, and in that glance, there was no hatred, no malice-only desperation. The kind born from hunger and frostbite and a fight to stay alive another night. He knew she was risking much by being here. He was risking plenty too. If neighbors or passing riders discovered her, the story would spread, and trouble would come swift. Yet the weight of her trembling against him struck deeper than fear. He shifted slightly, careful not to startle her. His voice came low, rough from the dry air. We're freezing. It wasn't a question, more a truth spoken out loud. She said nothing at first, only clutched the blanket tighter, her eyes never leaving his face. The silence hung between them like a taut rope, ready to snap with the wrong word. Something in him softened then, against every rule of frontier caution. She was not an intruder in that moment, not a rival. She was simply human, caught between the harsh world outside and the faint warmth inside his cabin. The thought struck him that maybe the frontier wasn't just about survival of one man against the elements, but about how strangers and enemies even might find themselves bound by the same struggle to endure. Still, danger lingered. He knew enough of the land to realize nothing ever happened without reason. A lone Apache woman wandering into a cowboy's cabin was no accident. Perhaps she was fleeing something or someone. Perhaps she was bait, meant to lower his guard. His hand twitched near the rifle again, torn between trust and instinct. But then her fingers brushed his sleeve, hesitant, almost pleading, and the weight of suspicion eased, if only for a moment. The fire gave one last pop, sending sparks into the dim air. Shadows danced across her face, showing the wear of miles traveled, the exhaustion that threatened to pull her under. He studied her closely, noticing the small details that stories in town never mentioned. She was young, but her eyes carried the depth of someone who had seen far too much. He wondered what roads had led her here, what choices had left her shivering at his side instead of with her own people. Sleep tugged at the edges of his mind, but the questions kept him awake. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever path she walked, it had just crossed into his, and nothing would be the same come sunrise. She shifted closer, her breath warm against the cold air, her presence stirring something he thought the wilderness had long beaten out of him. Hope, curiosity, and fear, all tangled together. The wind howled louder outside, as if warning of storms yet to come. He lay still, the weight of her beside him anchoring him in a moment that felt unreal, fragile, and dangerous. His thoughts circled back to one truth he couldn't ignore. By dawn, we would need to decide if he would push her away or stand beside her in whatever trouble she carried. But for now, in that thin space between night and morning, he was caught by the sight of her face in the firelight, so unexpected, so fierce, so human, that it stopped his heart cold. And just as the first gray light of dawn threatened the edge of the horizon, sound outside the cabin broke the fragile silence, a crunch of snow. Deliberate, heavy, and too close to be the wind. The sound outside was no accident. The cowboy stiffened, his hand sliding instinctively toward the rifle by the door. He did not move too quickly, afraid the creak of floorboards might give him away. The Apache woman beside him tensed as well, her body turning rigid, her dark eyes widening with a sharp awareness that told him she had heard it too. The fire had burned down to a soft glow, casting the cabin in half-shadows, and the silence that followed was worse than the noise itself. Whoever was out there knew how to move in the snow, slow and steady, careful enough to keep from alerting prey, but not careful enough to fool a man who had spent his life listening for trouble. He wondered who it could be. Outlaws sometimes drifted through the land, hunting for easy shelter or a place to rob. Settlers kept a wide berth of this stretch of country, and most nights the only company was coyotes or the occasional wolf pack. But the measured crunch of footsteps outside was no beast. This was human, and if it wasn't friend, it meant danger. The woman shifted slightly closer to him, her blanket rustling against the silence. He glanced at her and saw fear flash across her face, though it was quickly masked with something sharper, like resolve. She seemed to know, perhaps more than he did, about the weight of those steps outside. That told him two things at once. Whoever was out there might not be looking for him. They might be looking for her. He whispered low, almost under his breath, "Who's out there?" His eyes stayed locked on her, searching for an answer. She hesitated, then gave a small shake of her head. But it wasn't denial. It was something else, like she was unwilling or unable to speak the truth. That silence pressed heavier on him than if she had confessed outright. The wind rattled the shutters and the door shifted just enough to groan against its hinges. He raised his rifle and waited. The figure outside didn't try to come in, not yet. Whoever it was circled, testing, maybe counting the seconds to see if the cabin held life inside. He could almost picture the tracks being pressed into the snow, the deliberate marks that would tell any tracker the story of who had been there. The cowboy's heart pounded as he held his aim, but still no shadow appeared in the doorway. The steps faded, not gone, just farther, as though the figure was watching from the trees. He lowered the rifle slowly, though his muscles stayed tense. The woman's eyes never left the door, and her hand tightened on the edge of her blanket. He had half a mind to demand she explain herself, to tell him who she was running from, but something in the set of her jaw made him pause. She wasn't hiding out of choice. She was hiding out of necessity. And whatever was chasing her had just found his cabin. The cowboy leaned back against the bedroll, though his senses stayed sharp as a drawn blade. He tried to steady his thoughts. The land had always been full of rumors about conflict between settlers and Apache. whispers of raids, reprisals, and blood debts that never seemed to fade. Yet the woman beside him didn't look like someone bent on war. She looked like someone who had traveled miles without rest, who had been driven into the cold by forces bigger than herself. And now she had landed in his world, pulling him into her troubles whether he wanted them or not. He remembered the first time he had heard stories about the Apache. Around campfires, cowboys spoke of them as ghosts of the desert, quick and cunning, slipping from shadows without a sound. Some swore the Apache could vanish into the rocks and trees, watching without ever being seen. He had grown up half believing those tales, though he always took campfire talk with a grain of salt. Yet tonight, with this woman sitting beside him, he realized those stories had only ever scratched the surface of truth. She was flesh and blood, trembling yet unyielding, with a strength that spoke of a life lived under constant test. His curiosity grew, even as unease twisted in him. Why had she chosen his cabin of all places? Surely she had known the risk, stepping into the home of a cowboy who might have turned her away or worse. But maybe that was the point. Maybe desperation had pushed her past fear. Her eyes met his again, and for a heartbeat the air between them was thick with questions neither dared voice. He wanted to ask her name, but the timing felt wrong. Names meant trust, and trust was still a fragile thing balanced on the edge of night. Instead, he asked, what weighed heaviest on his mind? Are they coming back? His voice was steady, though he felt the tremor in his chest. She looked toward the shuttered window, then back at him. A slow nod was all she gave, and it was enough to chill him deeper than the winter air. The cowboy knew what that meant. Trouble had found its way to his doorstep, and he had two choices. He could send her back into the cold, wash his hands of her fight, and let fate decide. Or he could hold his ground, rifle in hand, knowing he might be pulled into a battle that was not his. Neither sat easy with him, but he also knew the kind of man he was. He had never turned his back on someone who needed help, no matter where they came from. That was the code the land demanded, even when it came at a cost. The night wore on, and the fire sank into glowing embers. The two of them sat in silence, listening to the world outside. Every howl of a coyote, every moan of the wind, seemed heavier than before, as if the wilderness itself held its breath. He could not shake the thought that eyes were watching, hidden in the trees, waiting for the right moment. As the first faint streaks of dawn painted the horizon, the cowboy rose and pushed aside the door. Snow stretched in every direction, pale and untouched except for the tracks. They circled the cabin like a predator sizing up prey, then led back into the tree line. He studied them carefully, his breath fogging the morning air. The prints were too heavy for a single traveler. There had been more than one, maybe three, maybe four. They had come close enough to test his defenses, then slipped away with the night. But the tracks told him they weren't gone for good. They would be back, and next time they would not leave so easily. When he stepped back inside, the woman was standing near the fire, her blanket still drawn tight. Her expression told him she already knew what he had seen. She had lived long enough with danger to read its signs without needing words. The cowboy set his rifle against the wall and took a slow breath. "You brought them here," he said, not with anger, but with the weight of truth. She flinched, then lifted her chin with quiet defiance. There was no apology in her eyes, only an unspoken plea he couldn't ignore. And that was when he realized this was no accident. Whatever storm she had carried into his cabin was just beginning, and he was now part of it. Whether he wanted to be or not, the line between his world and hers had been crossed, and there was no going back. The prairie outside stretched wide and empty, but the cowboy knew better. Somewhere out there, in the cover of trees or the shadow of the hills, men waited. Men who knew the woman was here. Men who would return. The silence of the land was only a pause before the coming storm. Inside, the cabin felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves understood the weight pressing against them. He met her gaze once more, and though no words were spoken, the truth between them was clear. The fight ahead would test both of them, and neither yet knew if they would survive it. Then, from far beyond the tree line, a sound rose faintly through the cold morning, arrow whistle, sharp and deliberate, carrying across the frozen ground. It was a signal, and it was meant for those already watching. The whistle lingered in the air, thin but sharp, echoing off the frozen trees like a hawk's cry. The cowboy's jaw tightened as he stood in the doorway, rifle in hand, eyes sweeping the horizon. Whoever gave that signal wasn't hiding anymore. It was a message, bold and deliberate, the kind of sound that said they weren't afraid of being heard. It wasn't just a call, it was a promise. Behind him, the Apache woman stood still as stone, her face unreadable, though her eyes told a different story. She knew what that whistle meant, perhaps better than he did. The way her hands clenched the blanket, the way her shoulders stiffened, told him she had heard it before. He wanted to ask her outright, to demand she tell him who was out there and why they had followed her here, but he held his tongue. Words weren't needed. The danger was answer enough. The cowboy scanned the snow again, tracing the prints that had circled the cabin. He thought about what it meant to be hunted. He had been in scraps before, against outlaws, against men too drunk or angry to back down. But this was different. This was patient, calculated. Whoever those men were, they weren't moving blind. They knew who they were after, and they had time to wait. He shut the door and turned back inside. The woman hadn't moved. She was watching him, studying the way he handled his rifle, as if measuring whether he could be trusted to stand his ground. He let out a slow breath, then leaned the rifle against the wall again. Though every muscle in his body stayed tight with readiness, the day dragged with a heaviness that pressed harder than work on the range ever had. He tried to go about his routine, splitting wood, tending to his horse in the lean-to, keeping the fire alive, but all the while, he felt eyes on him. The silence of the land wasn't silence at all. It was watchful. With every passing hour, the question deepened. Who were those men outside, and what did they want with the woman? When he returned to the cabin near midday, the woman was standing by the window slit, peering out at the endless white. He set down the bucket of water he had hauled from the creek and finally spoke what had been turning in his mind since dawn. If they're after you, I need to know why. She turned her gaze toward him, calm but firm. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she lifted her chin and spoke in careful English, her words low and steady. Not after you. Only me. That answer carried more weight than any explanation could. It told him everything and nothing at the same time. She had enemies. They had followed her. And by letting her inside, he had put himself square in their sights. He studied her, noticing how exhaustion pulled at the corners of her eyes, how her frame trembled with hunger more than cold. She had traveled far, and whatever she was running from had driven her to risk everything. He thought about the stories of captives, of conflicts between tribes and settlers, of old grudges that had sparked bloodshed across the desert. He couldn't know if any of those tales applied to her, but what he did know was that she was caught in something larger than herself. The tension between them grew thicker as the hours passed. He felt torn, caught between caution and compassion. Part of him wanted to saddle his horse, point her towards safer ground, and wash his hands of it. But another part, the part that had stared into her eyes the night before and seen desperation stripped bare, couldn't bring himself to send her out into the cold with hunters on her trail. By late afternoon, the wind picked up, carrying the bite of another storm. He stepped outside to chop more wood, his axe sinking into the frozen logs with a dull thud. Each swing echoed in the empty air, and with each one, his thoughts circled tighter. He had always believed the frontier was a place where a man could carve his life with his own two hands.
Fight!
But now he saw how easily another person's fight could become his own. When he returned inside, the woman had moved closer to the fire, her eyes closed, as if in brief rest. He set the wood down and studied her face, seeing not just fear, but also pride, the kind that would not bend easily. She was not weak. She was wounded but unbroken, and something about that stirred his respect. As the evening fell, another sound reached them, faint at first, then stronger, the distant whinny of horses. The cowboy stiffened, moving to the window slit. Against the gray light of dusk, he saw movement on the ridge, figures on horseback, dark against the snow. They weren't charging, they weren't hiding. They were waiting, lined like shadows against the horizon. He cursed under his breath, his hand tightening on the rifle. Counted 3 riders, maybe 4, keeping their distance but making themselves known. It was a warning as clear as the whistle had been. The woman rose to her feet, her blanket slipping from her shoulders. For the first time, he saw a flicker of something more than fear in her eyes. Determination. She stepped closer to the window and spoke softly, almost like a confession. They do not give up. Her words sank deep. He knew now there was no quick end to this. Whoever those men were, They weren't leaving until they had her. The cowboy felt the weight of his situation more than ever. He had spent years working cattle, facing storms, wrestling with the solitude of the open range, but he had never been tested like this. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival anymore. He was tied to her fate, bound by the choice he had made when he let her stay. As night fell, he fortified the cabin as best he could. He barred the door, checked the shutters, and set the rifle within easy reach. The woman watched him, silent but steady, as if she had seen men prepare for battle before. The fire burned low, casting their shadows long against the rough-hewn walls. Hours passed in uneasy silence. Outside, the horses shifted, their presence felt even in the darkness. The cowboy tried to rest but couldn't. His mind raced with questions he couldn't shake. Who were those riders? Were they Apache warriors from her own people, or had she crossed someone else entirely? Why had she chosen his cabin, his bedroll, his fire? The woman spoke again, her voice carrying across the dim room like the crackle of the fire. You should not help me, they will come, but you will be caught in it. Her words were not a warning meant to drive him away. They were something else, almost like regret. He met her gaze, steady and unflinching. Too late for that now, he said, and the truth of it settled between them. Outside, the land lay frozen and still, but the tension coiled tighter with each passing hour. The riders had made their presence known, and the cowboy knew it was only a matter of time before they moved. Whether they came in the dark or at dawn, the storm was coming, and he and the woman inside the cabin would face it together. And as the fire sank into embers, another sound broke the silence, a faint crack of a branch just beyond the walls, close enough to know the riders weren't waiting anymore. They were moving in. The crack of the branch outside snapped the silence like a rifle shot. The cowboy's head jerked toward the sound, his hand already closing around the rifle. His breath came low and steady, but his heart pounded hard enough to drown out the crackle of the fire. He motioned to the woman with a sharp gesture to stay back. She obeyed, slipping into the shadows near the far wall, her blanket pulled tight as though the wool alone might shield her from what was coming. The cowboy crept to the shutter, careful not to let the boards creak beneath his boots. He eased the wooden slat open just enough to see the pale light of the moon spilling across the snow. At first, there was nothing, only the skeletal outlines of trees swaying in the wind. Then he caught at movement. A figure pressed low against the trunk of a cottonwood, no more than 30 paces from the cabin. Another shifted just beyond, a darker shadow against the drift of white. They weren't charging, they were creeping closer, slow as wolves stalking a cornered deer. He let the shutter fall shut, back pressed against the wall. He knew what they were doing. They were testing his patience, trying to force him into a mistake. Men like that didn't rush in blind. They would wait for fear to take root, then strike when it mattered most. The cowboy clenched his jaw. He had seen cattle spooked into running off cliffs because they sensed predators circling. Tonight he felt much the same, cornered and waiting. The woman's eyes searched his face as he stepped back. Her lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but she held the words. It struck him then how much she must have seen in her life to hold her silence now. Fear was there, yes, but beneath it burned something harder, like a fire refusing to die. Ours dragged like years. The cabin walls groaned under the cold, and every sound outside seemed sharper than before. The cowboy forced himself to sit by the door, rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the faint glow of the dying fire. His body ached from stillness, but he dared not let himself rest. Sometime near dawn, the first real strike came. A stone clattered against the side of the cabin, sharp enough to echo inside. The woman flinched. The cowboy steadied his breathing, keeping his finger near the trigger. Another rock followed, then another, each one deliberate, each one sending a message. They weren't trying to break in, not yet. They were letting him know the circle was closing. The cowboy rose slowly and pushed the woman gently toward the back corner. Stay low, he whispered. She obeyed without question, though her eyes stayed locked on him, wide and unblinking. He could feel her trust pressing against his back, like a weight he hadn't asked for, but couldn't refuse. The door rattled suddenly, a quick shove from outside. He spun, rifle up, but the latch held firm. A man's shadow passed across the cracks of moonlight seeping in through the frame, then vanished again. Whoever it was wanted him to know they were close enough to touch the walls. The cowboy's knuckles whitened on the rifle. He had lived through rough cattle drives, through storms that stripped the land bare. But nothing had set his nerves on edge like the unseen men outside. They were toying with him, and he knew it. He also knew it wouldn't last. The real fight was coming, and it was only a matter of when. Through the night, the pressure built. Every so often, another sound reminded him of the danger, the snap of a twig, the faint jingle of a horse's bridle, the crunch of boots in snow. Each time, the woman tensed, her head turning toward the sound as if she could map their movements in her mind. He wanted to ask her who these men were, what they wanted, but he swallowed the words. Answers could come later, if there was a later. Right now, survival was all that mattered. When the first gray streaks of morning stretched across the horizon, he caught sight of them again. For riders now, clear against the light, their figures dark and unmoving on the ridge. They didn't advance, didn't retreat. They just sat there, horses stamping in the snow, like sentinels waiting for a signal. The cowboy felt the tension crawl higher. They were in no hurry. They were patient enough to wait until he cracked. Inside, the air was heavy with smoke from the fire and the sharp bite of fear. The woman finally spoke, her voice low and steady. They will not stop. The cowboy studied her face, seeing in her eyes that she had lived this before, maybe more than once. She knew their tactics, their persistence. He wanted to press her for more, but the words stuck. Instead, he said the only thing he could. The day crept forward with agonizing slowness. He worked through tasks with restless energy, hauling more wood, checking the horse, gathering what little food was left. All the while, he kept one eye on the ridge, where the riders watched like hawks. The woman stayed close to the fire, conserving her strength, but every so often, he caught her gaze sweeping the cabin, as if calculating what would happen if the walls fell. By late afternoon, the snow began again, soft flakes swirling in the wind. The storm brought a strange, quiet, muffling sounds, blurring the horizon. The cowboy knew this was no blessing. Storms offered cover. If the men outside planned to move, it would be under the veil of snow. He readied himself as best he could, checking the rifle, setting extra rounds close at hand. He positioned himself near the window slit, eyes straining to catch any movement through the thickening snow. His body was taut, every nerve pulled tight. The woman moved closer, her presence at his side a reminder he wasn't alone. He could feel the warmth of her shoulder near his, steady, despite the danger. She didn't speak, but her silence carried as much weight as any words could. She was here, with him, facing the storm head-on. Dusk fell heavy, the storm turning the world outside into a blur of white and shadow. The cowboy's breath fogged in the cold air as he waited, every muscle ready to spring. Then, at last, it came the faint but unmistakable crunch of boots, closer this time, circling the cabin once more. Then another sound joined it, the scrape of metal against wood, a probing test against the shutters. The cowboy's grip tightened on the rifle. He felt the woman's eyes on him, watching, waiting. The fire flickered low, shadows stretching long across the walls. The storm outside raged harder, howling through the trees, but inside the cabin, the silence pressed down with unbearable weight. He knew the moment was close. The men outside had played their game of waiting, and now the storm gave them cover to strike. The question wasn't if they would come, it was how and how soon. The cowboy steadied his breathing, shoulders squared, eyes locked on the door. The woman crouched low beside the fire, her hands clenched around the edge of her blanket, her face calm but taut with the knowledge of what was coming. Then it happened. The door shuddered hard under a heavy blow, the latch straining against the force. A second strike followed, louder, stronger. Snow and wind burst in through the cracks as the cabin shook. The cowboy raised his rifle, heart hammering, every sense alive. The woman's eyes flashed in the firelight, and in that instant, the cowboy knew the fight had found them. The storm outside howled, the walls groaned under the assault. And with each strike on the door, the tension coiled tighter. The clash they had been waiting for was no longer a question of when. It had arrived, crashing down with the storm, and the cabin was about to become a battleground. The door shook under the third strike. Harder than before, and the cowboy braced his shoulder against it, rifle aimed at the dark crack where snow and wind forced their way in. His muscles strained as he held firm, the wood groaning beneath the weight of men outside. A moment, it felt like the whole cabin might split apart. Then silence fell, heavy and sudden, as if the storm itself paused to listen. The cowboy held his breath, waiting for the next blow. None came. Instead, he caught the faint sound of voices, low and sharp, carried by the wind. The woman's eyes found his, and in their dark depths he read something he had not seen before. It's not just fear, not just strength, but recognition. She knew the voices. Her lips pressed tight, her jaw stiffening, as if she had braced for this moment long before it arrived. The men outside didn't strike again, they circled. The cowboy tracked their movements by sound, the crunch of boots in snow, the scrape of metal against the log walls, the creak of saddle leather when they shifted position. They were testing him, seeing how long he could hold before breaking. His grip on the rifle never wavered, though his mind raced. He could fight them, maybe hold them off for a time, but even the strongest walls wouldn't stand forever against men who refused to quit. Then came a voice louder than the rest, spoken in broken English, that carried through the storm. "Give her." The demand hung in the air, clear and heavy. The cowboy's pulse thundered in his ears. He glanced toward the woman. She stood near the fire, her shoulders squared, her blanket fallen to the floor. She shook her head once, slow and firm, as if telling him that surrender was not an option. The cowboy didn't answer right away. He thought about what kind of men these were. Not lawmen, not settlers. Carried themselves with the patience of hunters, the precision of those who knew the land like the back of their hand. He remembered the old campfire tales of Apache factions divided among themselves, of rival bands clashing as often as they clashed with settlers. It dawned on him, then, she wasn't being chased by strangers. She was being hunted by her own people. The realization sat heavy on his chest. Whatever had driven her to flee had not been a simple quarrel. It was deeper, more dangerous, and now he was caught in the middle. He squared his shoulders and called out, his voice steady despite the storm. "She's not leaving." His words echoed against the snow, swallowed quickly by the wind, but he knew they had been heard. The silence that followed was thick, charged. Then the sound of retreating steps faded into the storm. For a long moment the cowboy thought maybe they had given up. But the woman shook her head, eyes fixed on the door. "Not gone," she whispered. "They wait." She was right. All through the night the riders lingered just out of sight. The cowboy caught glimpses of them between gusts of snow, their shapes like shadows on the ridge. They didn't come again to strike the cabin, but their presence pressed heavier than any assault. They were patient, waiting for weakness, waiting for the storm or hunger to wear him down. Days passed in uneasy rhythm. Cowboy rationed what little food he had, splitting it between himself and the woman. He kept the fire alive, though wood was dwindling. Outside, the riders never left. At night, their whistles cut through the dark, taunting, reminding him that escape was impossible. During those long hours, the woman began to speak more. In fragments at first, then in steadier words. She told him her name, soft and proud on her tongue, though he kept it locked in his heart, private, like the trust she had given him. She explained little pieces of her story, how her people had split, how she had refused something that was demanded of her, how that refusal had turned her into prey. She didn't tell every detail, but she didn't need to. He could read enough between the pauses and the way her voice broke when she spoke of family left behind, in the steel that returned when she spoke of survival. For the cowboy, her story cut deep. Life on the range had taught him loneliness, the ache of days that stretched on without purpose beyond cattle and fences. He had thought himself hardened, but in her words, he heard echoes of his own fight, two souls bound by different roads, but the same struggle to endure. As the days bled into nights, something grew between them, something unspoken but undeniable. Not romance born from convenience, but respect, a recognition of spirit. They were two outcasts thrown together by fate, standing back to back against the storm. The standoff could not last forever. Supplies were running low. The horse grew restless in the lean-to, and the cowboy knew the men outside were waiting for desperation to force his hand. He weighed his choices every hour right out and faced them head-on, or hold the cabin until it collapsed around him. Neither path offered much hope. Then came the morning when the storm finally broke. The sky cleared, the snow glittered bright under the sun, and the riders stepped boldly from the trees. No longer shadows, They were clear, now for men, hard-faced, armed with rifles and bows, their eyes fixed on the cabin. They had waited long enough. The cowboy stood at the window, rifle ready, breath tight in his chest. Beside him, the woman placed a hand on his arm, steady and sure. She met his gaze, and in that moment he understood. This fight wasn't just his. It was theirs. The men outside shouted, their words sharp and demanding, echoing across the snow. The woman answered in her own tongue, her voice carrying strong and fierce. Though the cowboy couldn't understand the words, he felt the power in them, the defiance that rolled like thunder. The men shouted back, anger rising, but she didn't waver. The cowboy knew it was time. There would be no more waiting, no more circling. The standoff was about to break. He checked the rifle one last time, his jaw set, his eyes locked on the door. He felt the woman's presence beside him, not as a burden but as a partner. Whatever storm was about to come, they would face it together. And as the first man outside raised his weapon, the cowboy's heart pounded with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. Life on the frontier had always been about survival, about carving a place in a land that gave nothing easy. But now, it was more than that. Now it was about standing for something bigger than himself, about choosing to protect rather than surrender, about finding meaning in the fight. The crack of a rifle split the air, echoing across the snow, and the battle they had feared since that first whistle in the dark finally began. The struggle that followed was fierce and desperate. But when the smoke cleared and the snow settled, the cabin still stood. The riders were gone, shadows fading back into the wilderness from which they came. The woman remained weary but unbroken, her eyes carrying the weight of freedom she had fought for and earned. In the days that followed, the land grew quiet again. The cabin, once a place of solitude, had become something else entirely, a sanctuary forged in fire and storm. The cowboy and the woman shared the silence, not as strangers, but as survivors bound by trial. When at last the time came for her to leave, she stood in the doorway with the rising sun at her back, her figure framed by the endless horizon. She looked at him, and no words were needed. Respect and gratitude shone in her eyes, mirrored in his. She walked into the open plains, her path her own, her spirit unbroken. The cowboy watched until she was only a figure against the wide sky, then gone. He turned back to the cabin, the fire crackling inside, the land stretching wide and empty around him. The world was still hard, still lonely, but something within him had changed. He had seen courage, had shared in another's fight, and found a piece of meaning in the wilderness that had once felt endless. The prairie wind carried the last traces of her presence. Though she was gone, the memory of that night, the night an Apache woman sought warmth in his cabin and changed his life forever, would stay with him always. And as he set his rifle back by the door and tipped his hat low, he knew the land would never feel quite the same again.